Well, good morning, Yelm team. Um, so much apologize for this situation. First time in a long time that I've made history and not made it on time to an engagement. But if anything, it got everybody a little bit extra sleep, or at least a little bit more time this morning. But I really appreciate your flexibility and going to kind of jump right in and kind of get the day started. And hopefully, I will be already en route and seeing you soon. By the time you're watching this, I will have communicated and will know my arrival. But I want to just kind of dig in. For those of you I haven't met, I'm really excited to meet you. My name's Dave Nagel. Hopefully, you've had a chance to watch the webinars, and I'll do a more formal intro when I get a chance to meet everybody and see everyone else, my colleagues and friends that I had the pleasure of meeting last summer. But I wanted to dig into this term research real quick, because really when we talk about visible learning, that's everything that really kind of comes into play. But John Hattie would say research means to search again for what always worked. So let's kind of dig into some things about research. Let's get out of the realm of education for a while. In 2012, we identified, not we, but the medical profession, seizure stoppers. And if any of you have a loved one or a child that has seizures, you know what a blessing that has been, that has not only saved lives, but certainly saved countless traumatic experiences for families and everyone. And we now almost take it for granted that we've learned ways to address something that for the longest time was just really potentially fatal, and even just more so, just such a trauma for a lot of families. Don't even think anymore about having to check things on our onboard diagnostics. It kind of pops up for us. Back in the 80s, we learned how to make sure our little ones slept and saved countless fetal infant syndrome deaths in cribs by just learning how we need to help kids sleep at night. If any of you have ever been in an air crash or car crash, which I have with airbag deployment, it stings, but not as half as it would if you hit something else. Do I have to say anything about this one? Or is this just hopefully kind of a given? Started buckling up. I know there's some of us in the room here can remember as a kid, at least I do, sitting in the back seat, maybe standing in the back seat. Certainly wouldn't do that anymore. Doppler radar. Doppler radar in the 1980s and throughout the 1990s has increased the time of tornado warnings from 5.1 to approximately 9.2 seconds. I just counted to 9 Mississippi there. That time frame, depending on the geographic area, obviously, of where tornadoes are hitting, if they're more rural versus urban or suburban, has saved countless number of lives. Just that 9-second warning. But in the last, as I mentioned, decade to a decade and a half, it's increased by 4.5 seconds, and the numbers are staggering how many lives they know that has saved. So we can easily think of the impact of all those things in our personal lives. Now let's kind of dig into John Hattie's Show Me the Evidence. What has his research maybe told us? Now, teacher clarity, which is something you see Karen Flores, she's a colleague of mine who are putting a piece together called Developing a Formative Mindset, and I had pulled a couple of the slides from that. We've learned even so much more now how feedback must be aligned with clarity, and we're going to talk about that when we come together. Formative assessment. Back in the 70s, Benjamin Bloom and David Skirvin, who kind of originally coined the phrase, what he found was that when teachers use evidence from students, and not just written evidence, in terms of their level of engagement, they will significantly increase the impact on student learning. So we talk about assessment as feedback for us, dialogue versus monologue. It's not just formative assessment as pencil and paper. Formative evaluation is gathering all the evidence that I can when I'm determining the learning needs for my students. Goal setting. And the one I want to spend a few minutes on here this morning before I arrive is collective teacher efficacy, 1.57. 4 years growth in 1 year's time. Well, we're talking more about collective teacher efficacy today, and it's almost unfortunately becoming a buzzword. It was the mantra of the Visible Learning Institute last summer in San Francisco, where a lot of you attended. But I remember specifically Professor Hattie saying that his fear is that it will become something that doesn't have even close to the potential impact it could, because it becomes a buzzword. And we don't realize that collective teacher efficacy didn't originate here in the mid-2000s, mid-teens of 2000s. Bandura and a lot of others in the research back in the 70s found when that efficacy is in place, collectively, the impact is pretty profound. But what I want to talk about is one of the mind frames now, and how we can build off collective teacher efficacy. And the mind frame of being a change agent is 2 things. Number 1, they will not lament. They will not ignore challenges. For those of us to say poverty or minority status or second language learners or students that are coming from in a mobility situation where they're changing school, to say that that doesn't matter, that's putting our head in the sand. But what we're not going to do is lament. We're not going to dwell on the challenges. We're going to look at them as opportunities. The other thing that a change agent does is that they innovate. And not necessarily innovation for the sake of plugging something in. They will do whatever they need to get the learner that they're trying to move from point A to point B to get there. And so I want to examine for a minute, before we talk about collective teacher efficacy, we have to talk about our own self-efficacy. And what do we believe about our students, our colleagues, and what do we believe about ourselves? Because we cannot have collective teacher efficacy unless there's self-efficacy. One of the comments when I used to work at the Leadership and Learning Center, and they had a protocol, they had a data team process. And I always challenged this notion because they would, at the time, to being very transparent, competing with Solution Tree, who had a PLC model, and basically this was our PLC model, and they would say the PLC is what you are, but the data team is what you do. My challenge to that was always, but what if what you are isn't very good? It doesn't really matter what you do. So it's interesting. Self-efficacy. One's belief in one's ability to succeed in a specific situation to accomplish your task. The reason why this is important is that a growth mindset, and this is where some of us might need to catch ourselves for a second when we hear this, but a growth mindset shows to have an effect size of about 0.21. Carol Dweck and John Hattie are actually working on some pieces together, and the reason for that is growth mindset doesn't take into account specific situations. I can have a growth mindset about tying my shoes. But do I have the same growth mindset when things are tough? I have a growth mindset as an educator in August when things are really going well, and now we're getting into the time of the year when the honeymoon's over and it's getting a little bit more challenging and it's cold outside, or we get to a stage where our students are really struggling. And is that a time when we are just as strong with my fingers growth mindset? So self-efficacy, what we believe about ourselves, is very specific, and it can't just be when we want to use it. So we'll leave this quote up for just a moment. Task and situation specific. It's not about our general confidence and competence. We all know folks that they're really happy and buzzing when things are going well, but when stuff starts going tough, struggle a little bit. Maybe we know someone personally. My hand's getting raised because I'm the biggest one that sometimes struggles with living out my beliefs and all the things I say when things get tough. It just makes us human. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment. This is where Brian or Lisa, who's ever in the room, and ask you to pause the webinar. And you have an article called Self-Efficacy, Why Believing in Yourself Matters. It's not on page 5. I just printed it out from a separate handout. But as you read, I'd like to ask you to highlight phrases that speak to you and share out with, I'm going to call your community. Now, your community is your school. It's the group you brought together today. That is your community. I'm going to be intentional with that term throughout our session today. So take a few moments. I'm going to ask you to read that self-efficacy quick read. I'm going to pause just momentarily. You guys pause the recording whenever you're finished. Go ahead and bring me back. Welcome back. So hopefully you had a chance to complete that read. Now I want to ask you to do for a moment is you don't have the survey. I'm going to give you the survey actually later in the day. It was something that I kind of planned to do this piece actually when we came back after lunch, but I actually think it almost sets the stage well for our entire day. But when you think about the article, where do you have strengths around self-efficacy? Where do you want to grow? I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to capture those strengths and opportunities of your community or your school. You have a piece of chart paper, and I'd like you to kind of maybe even put a line because I want you to keep these at the bottom of your chart paper. There's a reason why as we kind of fill that out throughout the day. But what are your strengths and opportunities related to what you've read and what I've shared so far about self-efficacy? Take a moment, discuss, put those pieces at the bottom of your chart paper. I'll bring us back in just a moment. Good time to go ahead and pause the recording. Welcome back. So hopefully you've had a chance to discuss, put those strengths and your opportunities at the bottom of that. And one of the things about that article, and I've sent it to Brian and Lisa as well electronically that they'd sent out to you, but I embed several links within there that dig into some of Bandura studies and a few other pieces. So it actually is a much larger article. And then that also includes self-efficacy survey There just wasn't a time to do this morning. So you'll have that self-efficacy survey to kind of build onto this. But I think the read alone kind of builds into where I'm kind of guiding us here for this first part of the morning. Because I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier. We cannot get to this collective teacher efficacy piece until we examine ourselves. We have to look at our own self-efficacy and realize sometimes it's situation specific, and that just makes us human. What do we believe about our colleagues? And quote here from Bandura that I'm just going to go ahead and read, but these expectations around efficacy play a major factor in the choice of activities, the amount of effort expended, and how long peers will sustain when dealing with them in the stressful situations. So when we talk about this individual into collective efficacy, it's because we got to be able to have it when things are a little tough. When we bust our tail and we think the kids are doing well, and all of a sudden the assessment or test results come back and it's not what we wanted. Or there's a time of year and it hits every school, and sometimes it hits some at different times or more often than others, when just the proverbial what hits the fan. How will we stick with what we said we were going to stick with and not revert back to what is safe or what is easy? When we collectively are leaning on each other, that's what's going to build towards that selective efficacy. And so I wanted to just give us a chance to think about this little piece. When we think about our teacher dialogue, and I go back to that point about being a change agent, they will not lament. When our dialogue dwells and lives on the overwhelming challenges, it undermines itself a sense of efficacy. Great book called Positivity, which is the sort of soft science, but some pretty solid research around what organizations have done in terms of moving forward. And the Cliff Notes version is what they found was that in any organization, no matter the size, no matter the focus, it needed to be at least 3-to-1 positive to negative comments. We need to live in an area where we're focusing on working together, addressing certain learning, motivation, challenging each other in a good way. What they did find, and this would make sense, when the positive to negative comments got past 8 or 9 or into the 10-to-1 range, success and impact actually diminished. So it's not just having rose-colored glasses. It's being honest. And as I mentioned, a change agent doesn't ignore challenges. They just don't lament and live there. So where is our dialogue living? And certainly I would imagine that the group here today is leaning more on that 3-to-1 positive, but we know some of our teams, some of our colleagues that we work with. Where is the dialogue living? Not where we visit, because we all have bad days, but where are we living? And so as leaders, how do we create the conditions to promote collective teacher efficacy, which will come down to these 3? And this is sort of the catalyst. As I'm going to give us one more piece to think and talk about, and then hopefully by this point in time, not that it just has to happen for me to be present, but we'll get into the rest of our day. But collective teacher efficacy is promoted by these 3 things: applying new knowledge, developing mastery learning experiences as the teacher, as the educator, positive interdependence, and then having fine-grained discourse around learning, which is why when we dig into the evidence and the protocol sharing a little bit, I've guided some ways that we can challenge each other just a little bit around making sure that we're really digging in. And for example, if we're thinking about a PLC setting and we're looking at our student results, it's not just the students got 7 out of 10 right. It's why did they, or why are they missing some of those other ones, but why did they get some of the ones right? So when we're seeing some of the evidence around how our students are describing learning, or certain classrooms where there's different success criteria findings, why? And so that applying new knowledge and positive interdependence is where I'm kind of guiding us with this just last part of this webinar activity to start our day. And I'm going to go back to that point about a change agent. We all know individuals who show up for professional development first so they can sit in the back. But this is for any of us. And you remember what I talked about, a change agent. What do? They innovate. When our initial anticipation and curiosity would turn to withdrawal, we seek comfort. When we are too comfortable trying to learn something new, or we're not trying to learn something new, we're not making any connections. We're consolidating what we already know, and we're leaving it there. We're not trying to take that new idea, that new concept, that new protocol, that new element around anything that we're learning and apply it to what's existing. And this is no different than with our student learners. We have to allow and drive and try and push for that conceptual and to transfer understanding. So when we think about how we're guiding our teacher learning, there has to be an expectation for mastery. Teachers will seek out, as they should, activities that are consistent with their orientation to learning. As you see here on the statement, should engagement in that learning activity lead to changes in knowledge, practice, or belief, the orientation to learning system changes. Sometimes we don't change belief, we change behavior. Sometimes we got to get people to think differently about things, and then the behavior follows. But as that orientation to new learning changes, teachers seek out different types of learning activities. I'm actually going to go to my colleague who's been talking about that success criteria piece. I'm going to go to that teacher who's been talking about one of the things I've heard. I'm going to seek out maybe a book study. I'm going to come to my principal, or I'm going to come to Lisa and say, how can I learn more about that? And so one of the things I want us to think about as we go into our evidence sharing, what is the hard evidence we've gathered? But what are some of those, at times, important anecdotes? We don't need to live in anecdotes. But sometimes there's one or two teachers or one or two students that they do tell a pretty good story when I relate it to all the other evidence and data that I have. Are we seeing more teachers seeking out more of the opportunities to learn? Are we seeing groups in a PLC meeting outside of their actual time that they had to meet? And so to kind of wrap this piece up and give you a chance to kind of process and make some final connections, but when we're developing mastery, when we're learning as anyone, but specifically our teachers, that's when we can weigh, here's what I got to get better at. Here's what I need to possibly, improve upon, or here's what I'm good. And so what I really want us to push on, because throughout the day, and I'm kind of guiding us here, and as I kind of thought about maybe things happen for a reason, because I might not have led with this, but when I really thought about our day and our journey so far together, everything around visible learning has to come back to how we're monitoring our adult learning. And we're creating success criteria for our adult learning. When we have a new professional development, when we have a staff meeting, when we have an early release, and we're learning a new strategy, we're learning a new piece, we're adding on to whatever it is we're doing, and we set the expectation that here's what we should see in classrooms, here's what we should see in terms of a change. And so I've also sent this quick example to Brian. This is specifically from a district I'm working at in Illinois, who when they come back after the semester break, they're going to be doing some professional development on day one, and then right after that, they're giving their teachers an opportunity to kind of practice. And it's about developing success criteria from unwrapped targeted math standards, and then to monitor how their students understand those success criteria. So what you see here is there's specific application for mastery. First of all, we've communicated to the staff, here's what you should be able to do. But then there's an intentionality to make sure you get to practice this multiple times. Now they're coming back to school, believe, memory serves, on January 3rd, which I believe is a Wednesday. Could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, because then what they said was we wanted to give the teachers a little bit of time, but this is where, as leaders, and again, leaders is all of us in this room, and I know we have some classroom teachers all the way up to principals, superintendents, certainly with Brian, but that we're disciplined, that our walkthroughs, that the evidence gathering that we're going to do when we go into classrooms is specifically back to what we just taught. No different than if I'm a teacher and I've given a lesson, given some direct instruction, modeled some things on the board, worked some math problems, done a science demonstration. That's what I should be checking for when I'm walking around the room. That's what I'm checking for in the homework the very next day. And so what you can see there, and you have this in your handout, that we're intentional with looking for that. And there's a balance between, hey, it was attempted, and it was attempted and done with quality. Initially, just needs to be attempted, because if it's not attempted, it's certainly not happening with quality. But over time, they'll start to merge with each other. And then the last point I want to make. We sometimes have evaluated professional development based on the exit tickets at the end of the day. Now, that's great sometimes if everybody likes the snacks, they like the jokes, they like that we got to sleep in a little bit this morning, all those kind of things. But all joking aside, but are we following up then on the 7th of February and April 10th to allow leaders, and leaders is now everyone in this room, sort of what I would call your building impact team, possibly is a term that I use, a BIT team. Certainly there's another term you might be using, to determine the impact of the professional development, to then make the adjustments along the way. And giving teachers that ability to understand and apply new knowledge. So here's where I'm going to give us about 5 to 7 minutes, and with my fingers crossed, hopefully by this point in time I will have arrived and we'll move on. If not, got another webinar set for everybody. But now to kind of turn and talk with your team, what are some collective efficacy takeaways that I've kind of shared and modeled and given an example of, and then linked back to your reading around self-efficacy? Because we can't get to some of the bigger pieces we shared and get to that 1.57 if we don't start with ourselves. So really appreciate everyone's patience and flexibility. I probably would have paused and checked for some understanding and taken some questions. Just kind of a impromptu experience with the webinar, but hopefully you were able to gather it enough. I'll send everybody the slides. So if there's anything I went through fast here, certainly. But do a turn and talk, and hopefully by this point in time, I'll be seeing everybody very, very soon. Thanks for your flexibility, and we'll talk here in just a little bit.